the year 1351, the King of England decided that the most important seat in his entire government should not be a throne. It should be a sack, a plain square cushion stuffed with raw fleece, placed in the chamber where the highest lawmakers in the land would sit and argue and rule. Centuries later, that same wool-stuffed seat is still sitting inside the Houses of Parliament in London, and the Lord Speaker of the House of Lords still sits on it today. Not on gold, not on velvet, over oak, on a bag of wool. Because for a stretch of English history, wool was not just a fabric. It was the thing that paid for wars, built cathedrals, financed kings, and quietly decided who lived in comfort and who lived in debt. One king taxed it so heavily to fund a war against France that the conflict dragged on for 116 years, even though history books shortened it to a tidier number and called it the 100 Years' War. A sheep's coat did that. Not gold, not spices, not steel, wool. And that is really the whole story in miniature, because almost nobody thinks about wool that way. To most people today, it is a sweater, a blanket, maybe a pair of hiking socks. To history, it was something closer to a currency with legs, an empire-building material that happened to also keep people warm, and one of the most quietly brutal commodities humanity has ever organized itself around. The story does not begin in a castle or a counting house, though. It begins somewhere far less glamorous, in the highlands of what is today Iran and across the wider arc of Mesopotamia, the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in modern Iraq and Syria. Somewhere between 9,000 and 11,000 years ago, communities there started keeping wild sheep close to their settlements, not for their coats, but for their meat, their milk, and their skins. These early sheep did not look anything like the fluffy white animals people picture today. They were closer to goats, covered in a coarse, hairy outer coat with only a thin, downy undercoat hidden beneath it. For thousands of years, that undercoat went almost completely unused. If early humans wanted the soft fiber, they had to pluck it by hand from rocks and thorn bushes, where molting sheep had rubbed themselves raw. A slow and unreliable harvest that yielded barely enough fiber to be worth the effort. Wool, in other words, was an accident waiting to be noticed. Archaeological evidence from sites in Iran suggests that around 6,000 years before our era, something changed. Statuettes and carved depictions from that period begin showing sheep with a noticeably different silhouette. Fluffier, rounder, less like the lean wild mouflon and more like the woolly animals we would recognize now. Somebody, somewhere, had started deliberately breeding sheep for their coats instead of just their meat. It would take roughly another 2,000 years before archaeologists find the first physical evidence of actual woven wool garments, dated to around 4,000 years before our era. 2,000 years between noticing the potential of wool and actually figuring out how to spin and weave it into cloth a human being could wear. To put that in perspective, that gap is longer than the time separating us from the Roman Empire. An entire civilizational eternity passed between domesticating the right kind of animal and successfully turning its coat into clothing. Once that leap happened, wool spread outward from the ancient Near East along the same trade arteries that carried grain, metal, and pottery. By the Bronze Age, archaeological digs across continental Europe are turning up spindle whorls, loom weights, and fragments of woolen textile in such density that researchers now talk about specialized wool-producing regions existing as early as 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. Wool was no longer a byproduct of keeping sheep. In some communities, it had become the entire point of keeping sheep in the first place. Bone analysis from these sites shows herds increasingly dominated by sheep and goats over cattle and pigs, a sign that whole local economies were quietly reorganizing themselves around fleece. The Greeks dressed in wool, the Romans dressed in wool, and Roman writers describe deliberately crossbreeding fine-wooled rams from North Africa's Atlas Mountains with the dark-fleeced sheep of Iberia to chase ever finer fiber, centuries before anyone had coined the word merino. Wool by this point had quietly become one of the 4 fibers, alongside silk, cotton, and linen, that clothed almost the entirety of the pre-modern world. But of those 4, Wool had one decisive advantage that no warm climate fiber could match: insulation. Wool trapped air. Wool repelled water even when damp. Wool kept a human body alive through winters that would have been lethal in linen or cotton. That single property is the quiet engine underneath everything that happens next. Because whoever controlled good, fine wool was effectively controlling who got to survive a northern European winter in comfort instead of misery. By the Middle Ages, that control had a very specific home: England. The damp, grassy hills of the English countryside turned out to be almost perfectly suited to raising sheep. And by the 13th century, English wool had become, in the words of one economic historian, unrivaled anywhere else in Europe. Monasteries became some of the largest wool producers on the continent. The Cistercian abbeys of Yorkshire alone ran staggering operations. Records suggest Rievaulx Abbey maintained flocks of around 14,000 sheep, while Fountains Abbey, the largest of them, ran closer to 18,000. These were not small farming operations. They were industrial-scale wool factories run by monks, and the raw fleece they produced was shipped across the English Channel to the great cloth-weaving cities of Flanders, places like Bruges, Ghent, and Ypres, where it was spun, dyed, and woven into some of the finest cloth in Europe. This created one of the first truly interdependent international supply chains in European history. English farmers and monasteries grew the raw material. Flemish weavers turned it into finished cloth. And merchants in both countries grew enormously wealthy, moving it between the two. English kings noticed wool exports could be taxed at a single bottleneck point. And from the late 13th century onward, the crown began funneling almost all wool exports through one designated port, a system called the staple. For much of the 14th and 15th centuries, that port was Calais, an English-controlled outpost on the French coast at the narrowest crossing point of the Channel. Every sack of wool that passed through Calais was taxed, and those taxes became one of the single largest sources of royal income in medieval England. By some estimates, in the reign of Henry V, well over half the crown's total revenue came from duties on wool. This is the part of the story that explains the wool sack. Edward III, who ruled from 1327 to 1377, leaned on wool taxation so heavily to finance his military ambitions that when the Flemish cloth towns appealed to him for protection against their French overlords, he went to war, a conflict that started in 1337 and, despite its famous nickname, actually ran on and off for 116 years before it finally ended in 1453. The Hundred Years' War, named for convenience rather than accuracy, was substantially bankrolled by taxes on sheep's coats. It is genuinely difficult to find a cleaner historical example of an ordinary, everyday material directly financing the kind of large-scale, generation-spanning warfare that reshaped the map of Western Europe. The money did not just disappear into war chests either. It built things you can still walk through today. The small Suffolk town of Lavenham in eastern England grew so wealthy from the wool trade in the late medieval and Tudor periods that, despite its modest size, it was reportedly counted among the 14 wealthiest towns in all of England. Its surviving timber-framed merchant houses and its enormous parish church, built almost entirely with wool money, still stand. Across the country, the wool trade is credited with financing dozens of England's largest medieval cathedrals and an enormous number of parish churches, structures so disproportionate to the size of the towns around them that locals nicknamed some of them wool churches. None of this wealth, though, was distributed evenly, and that is where the story turns considerably darker. The same demand for wool that built Lavenham's church also drove a slow, grinding transformation of the English countryside, known as enclosure, in which land that had once been common ground, available to ordinary villagers for grazing their own animals and growing food, was fenced off by wealthy landowners and converted into private sheep pasture. Land that once supported dozens of subsistence farming families could, as pasture for a single flock, generate enormous profit for a single landlord while displacing the people who had worked it for generations. Enclosure would eventually become one of the defining and most socially destructive processes in English agricultural history, and its roots trace directly back to the simple economic fact that wool, pound for pound, was worth more than the people who could have farmed that same land for food. While England was building its wool economy on monastic flocks and taxed exports, a different country was quietly assembling a wool monopoly, so tightly controlled it bordered on the absurd. In medieval Spain, particularly across the dry plains of Extremadura, Castile, and Andalusia, a distinct breed of sheep was taking shape through centuries of selective crossbreeding, possibly drawing on North African bloodlines brought over in earlier centuries. By the 15th century, this breed, eventually known as the Merino, was producing wool of a fineness that put Spain in direct competition with England for dominance of the European luxury cloth market. The animals were organized under a powerful institution called the Mesta, a council that regulated the enormous twice-yearly migrations of merino flocks between summer pastures in the north and winter pastures in the south, along designated sheep walks that still exist on Spanish maps today, called Cañadas Reales. Some of these migrating flocks, owned by the highest nobility and the church, eventually numbered in the tens of thousands of animals. Spain guarded this wool so jealously that, according to numerous historical accounts, exporting a live merino sheep out of the country was treated as a capital offense, an act punishable by death. Whatever the precise frequency of executions, which is genuinely difficult to verify with certainty across centuries of patchy record-keeping, the underlying policy is well documented. Spain ran what amounted to one of the most successful trade monopolies in pre-modern history, built entirely around a single domesticated animal, and it protected that monopoly through the harshest legal deterrent available. For roughly 300 years, if you wanted the finest wool cloth in Europe, you needed Spanish Merino fiber, and Spain made absolutely sure you could not simply go get the sheep yourself. That monopoly finally cracked in the 18th century, not through theft or smuggling, but through diplomacy. Spanish kings, most notably Charles III, began gifting small breeding flocks of merino sheep to the royal courts of other nations as gestures of goodwill. To Saxony, to France, where the flock formed the basis of what became known as the Rambouillet breed, to Hungary, Sweden, and Prussia. Once the genetic monopoly was broken, it spread with startling speed. American diplomat David Humphreys imported merino sheep into New England in the first years of the 19th century, triggering what is sometimes remembered as a literal merino mania in Vermont, where breeding rams reportedly sold at auction for sums equivalent to a small fortune. But the most consequential transplant of all happened on the other side of the world, in a British penal colony that, at the time, nobody would have guessed would one day produce more wool than anywhere else on Earth. In 1797, a ship called the Reliance arrived at Sydney's Port Jackson, carrying a small number of merino sheep purchased, almost by accident, from the estate of a recently deceased Dutch colonial official at the Cape of Good Hope in southern Africa. A handful of those animals, just a few ewes and rams, were given to a British Army officer and amateur farmer named John MacArthur. MacArthur was, by most contemporary accounts, a difficult, litigious, and ruthlessly ambitious man, later notorious for helping organize a colonial coup known as the Rum Rebellion. But he correctly identified that the Australian climate could grow merino wool to rival anything coming out of Spain or Saxony. While MacArthur spent years away in England, frequently in disgrace, the day-to-day breeding work fell largely to his wife, Elizabeth MacArthur, who managed and expanded the flocks at their property, Elizabeth Farm in Parramatta, and later at the much larger Camden Park estate, southwest of Sydney. In 1807, a sample bale of their wool was auctioned at Garraway's Coffee House in London, a building that had served as an informal trading floor for merchants for well over a century. The numbers tell the rest of the story almost by themselves. In 1800, the colony of New South Wales held roughly 6,000 sheep. By 1850, that number had risen past 16 million. By 1891, it had passed 61 million. Wool, which had begun as a handful of animals salvaged almost by chance from a dead Dutch governor's estate, had turned an entire continent into the dominant wool-producing landmass on Earth, a position Australia still holds today. Back in Britain, the raw material pouring in from colonies like Australia needed somewhere to be turned into finished cloth, and that somewhere was a once unremarkable market town in West Yorkshire called Bradford. At the turn of the 19th century, Bradford was a town of around 13,000 people, where wool spinning and weaving still happened largely in cottages and small workshops. The Industrial Revolution detonated that arrangement almost overnight. Steam-powered mills, fed by local coal and built from local sandstone, multiplied across the town. By 1851, Bradford's population had grown to over 100,000 people, and the town was processing an estimated 2/3 of all wool production in the entire United Kingdom. Locals and historians alike began calling it Worstidopolis, the wool capital of the world. But the human cost of that growth was severe, and it fell hardest on children. Inside the mills, the smallest and youngest workers were assigned a job literally called scavenging, crawling beneath active, unguarded spinning machines to collect loose fibers while the equipment kept running around them. A task that was both physically punishing and genuinely dangerous. Other children, called piecers, worked shifts of up to 14 hours rejoining threads that snapped on the machines, developing chronic sores on their hands from the constant friction. Some desperately poor families, unable to support their children otherwise, reportedly sold them outright to mill owners as labor. The air inside these mills was thick with wool dust, and the dye works that colored the finished cloth used fixatives containing dioxin, chromium, and formaldehyde. Chemicals workers handled daily with no masks and no protective clothing of any kind. One of Bradford's most famous mill owners, Titus Salt, eventually built an entire model village called Saltaire on the outskirts of town, with proper housing, a hospital, a library, and parks for his workers. An experiment in industrial paternalism that was, depending on how generously you read it, either a genuine act of social reform or a calculated way to keep a productive workforce healthy enough to keep running the machines. Either way, Saltaire still stands today, and it stands as a quiet monument to just how harsh the ordinary version of mill life must have been that an employer building decent housing was considered remarkable enough to be remembered for it. Not every chapter in wool's global story involves factories and trade routes, though. Some of the most painful history attached to this fiber happened thousands of miles from any mill, in the high desert canyons of the American Southwest. Sheep, specifically a hardy Spanish breed called the Churro, arrived in what is now New Mexico and Arizona with Spanish colonization in the 16th century, and over the following centuries they were adopted and transformed by the Navajo, or Diné, people into a distinct land race known today as the Navajo-Churro. Churro wool, prized for its long, lustrous, naturally varied fibers, became central not just to Navajo economic life, but to an entire weaving tradition that remains internationally celebrated to this day. At their peak, Diné families managed flocks that, across the wider Four Corners region, numbered in the millions of animals. That changed catastrophically in the 1860s, as part of a U.S. military campaign led by Colonel Kit Carson against Navajo resistance to forced relocation. Soldiers carried out a deliberate scorched earth strategy, burning crops and peach orchards, destroying homes, and systematically killing Navajo livestock, including enormous numbers of churro sheep, specifically to starve the Diné into surrender. The campaign worked. Thousands of Navajo men, women, and children were forced into a roughly 300-mile march, remembered today as the Long Walk, to an internment camp at Bosque Redondo, near present-day Fort Sumner, New Mexico, a place the Diné call Hueldi, meaning the place of suffering. The flocks that had sustained Navajo life for generations were reduced from many thousands of animals to, by some accounts, fewer than 1,000 survivors by the time internment ended in 1868, and the Navajo were permitted to return to a portion of their homeland. The federal government issued replacement sheep, but largely different breeds, which interbred with and steadily diluted the original Churro bloodline over the following decades. It would take more than a century and a dedicated, deliberate conservation effort beginning in the 1970s, before the original Navajo-Churro breed was pulled back from the edge of disappearing altogether. Today, trading posts like the Hubble Trading Post in Ganado, Arizona, which has operated continuously since the 1870s, still stand as physical reminders of just how central sheep, wool, and weaving were and remain to Navajo economic and cultural survival, even after an attempt to use that very economy as a weapon against the people who depended on it. By the 20th century, wool's grip on global clothing had begun loosening for an entirely different reason. Chemistry. The commercial introduction of nylon in the late 1930s, followed after the Second World War by polyester and other synthetic fibers, gave the world something it had never had before: a fabric that could be manufactured in a factory from petroleum byproducts rather than grown, sheared, and processed from a living animal over the course of a year. Synthetics were cheaper to produce at scale, easier to care for, and did not require millions of acres of grazing land. Demand for wool, particularly the everyday lower-grade kind used in mass-market clothing, began a long, slow decline that the wool industry spent decades trying to manage rather than accept. In Australia, the country that had built its modern economy on the back of MacArthur's sheep, the government and the wool industry attempted to engineer their way around this decline by propping up prices artificially. Starting in 1970, a body called the Australian Wool Corporation operated a so-called reserve price scheme, buying up wool whenever the market price threatened to fall below a guaranteed minimum, in theory, stabilizing the market for farmers. For about 2 decades, it worked well enough that few people questioned it, but the guaranteed floor price kept climbing under political pressure. Mills kept buying confidently because the floor protected them from risk, and farmers kept producing more wool than the world actually wanted to buy at that price. By 1991, the corporation had accumulated a stockpile of more than 4.5 million bales of unsold wool, financed by billions of dollars in debt, with storage and interest costs running into the millions of dollars every single day. In February of 1991, the Australian government finally pulled the plug, abandoning the reserve price entirely. The market price of wool collapsed overnight, falling by roughly 40% in a single stroke. It would take until 2001, an entire decade, for the country to finish selling off the remaining stockpile. Farms went bankrupt. Wool processing businesses across Europe, in countries like Germany, Italy, and France, that had built contracts around the artificially high floor price, collapsed alongside it. It remains one of the more dramatic cautionary tales in modern agricultural economics, and it happened almost 200 years after John and Elizabeth MacArthur's first experimental flocks, because of the very same fiber. And yet, wool did not disappear. If anything, in recent decades, it has quietly reinvented itself. The same merino fiber that Spanish kings once protected with the threat of execution is now marketed worldwide as a premium technical fabric, prized by hikers, runners, and outdoor brands for properties that synthetic fibers still cannot fully replicate. Natural temperature regulation, genuine moisture-wicking performance, and a remarkable resistance to picking up odor even after days of heavy use. The countries that now dominate the global supply, principally Australia and New Zealand, descend directly from those 18th and 19th century transplants of a once forbidden Spanish breed. China, meanwhile, has become the largest single buyer of that wool, processing it into the modern clothing and textiles sold around the world. A quiet continuation of the same basic pattern that has defined wool for thousands of years. Raw fiber grown in one place, transformed into finished cloth somewhere else entirely, with enormous value created and captured at every step in between. What is genuinely strange? Looking back across all of it, the Mesopotamian herders plucking fiber off thorn bushes, the Cistercian monks counting flocks in the tens of thousands, the kings who taxed sheep heavily enough to fund a war that outlasted several generations, the Spanish crown threatening death for a single smuggled ram, the children crawling beneath running machinery in Bradford, the Navajo flock slaughtered to force a surrender, the Australian stockpile that grew so large it nearly broke a national economy is that wool itself never really changed all that much. A sheep today grows essentially the same fiber a sheep grew 11,000 years ago in the hills near Mesopotamia. What changed over and over again was what human beings decided that fiber was worth, and what they were willing to do to control it. The sheep never asked to fund the 100 Years' War. It never asked to become a state monopoly punishable by death, or a justification for displacing peasants from common land, or a weapon used against an entire indigenous nation, or a multi-billion-dollar stockpile rotting in a warehouse. People did all of that around an animal that simply grew a warm coat and shed it once a year, the same as it always had. So the next time you see a wool sweater folded on a shelf, or a blanket at the foot of a bed, it might be worth remembering that you are looking at the same basic material that once sat underneath a king deciding whether to go to war, that once justified the death penalty in medieval Spain, that once built a continent's economy from a handful of smuggled sheep, and that, somewhere in a parliament building in London right now, is still quite literally being sat on by the people who write the laws. To most people, it is just wool. To history, it has been money, power, survival, and occasionally tragedy, all woven into the same thread. What ordinary object do you think changed the world the most? Let us know in the comments and tell us what everyday item you think people still underestimate today.